From Radio New Zealand International, this is Mailbox.
And welcome to Mailbox, our final program for DX listeners. I'm Myra O.
And I'm Adrian Sainsbury. Today, for the last time, we have the latest space weather from Mike Bird in Melbourne, and of course letters to share.
Adrian and I will be taking you down memory lane, hearing some of the voices that have graced the Mailbox microphones over the years. So stay with us.
Kia ora, haere mai, and welcome.
Radio New Zealand presents Mailbox.
Hello listeners, we've had a huge pile of letters. Most of them have been Christmas greetings and greetings for the new year.
The sound of Mailbox 65 years ago. In those days, it was a weekly program. Many voices have graced the Mailbox microphone over the decades. Many of you, of course, will remember the ace DXer of all time, Arthur Cushion.
Well, in 1932, King George V's Christmas broadcast, it was 3 a.m. in New Zealand. My father had a Stuart Warner radio, and we used to charge the batteries up during the daytime so we could listen at night, but he got a loan of Philco from Beggs's, and my granny, who came out from England in 1886. Of course, we were all gathered round, and it was a momentous broadcast because that was, to hear the King of England speaking through the radio. And, of course, that sort of interest in it, and just an interesting twist, in February 1942, just 10 years later, the BBC wrote and asked me would I start sending reports to London, and I've been doing that for nearly 55 years each week.
And that was Arthur Cushion. Tony King hosted Mailbox back in 1990.
Well, I look back to my early days with Radio New Zealand shortwave when it was 7.5 kilowatts, and of course, with the power of that volume, a station down in the South Pacific was very sought after by DXs. In fact, in the 15 minutes we had with, I think it was called Mailbox at that time, we even had a Japanese contribution with a student from Japan helping us with the Japanese segment. When in 1991 we went over to 100 kilowatts, that created an avalanche of mail, particularly from overseas, and it was not surprising that we had a lot more listeners than we'd ever had with 7.5 kilowatts. That 100 kilowatt transmitter also enabled us to start up calling Japan, which we did on a Saturday and a Sunday night from 11 hours UTC. And while that program was rather short-lived, it at least had a popular audience in Japan in the weekends. The 100 kilowatts, of course, also spurned an interest in people coming to New Zealand. And I was thrilled to have people from Belgium, Japan, the United States, Denmark and Finland come in the first few years of the 100 kilowatt transmitter, and it was nice to have them on Mailbox and also to give me the opportunity of taking them to our transmitter up in the middle of the North Island. And so today I still listen to shortwave, though my penchant is now for medium wave. As United States listeners would know all about the 1600 to 1700 kilohertz band, the X band. We're fortunate down here in New Zealand to be able to more or less listen to the whole of the east and west coast of the US, and I've had some very amazing reception of stations of only 1,000 watts from the east coast of US on one of these lovely little radios that give you a bandwidth selection of 1 through to 5 kilohertz. There's certainly the way in which DXing is going ahead. One of the highlights, of course, in the Mailbox program was the contribution from Arthur Cushion in Invercargill, and we enjoyed every time we recorded calling Arthur in Invercargill to see what he'd heard and what he was recommending that listeners should listen to. Of course, Arthur had been DXing and monitoring for overseas stations for many years and was at one time a voluntary monitor for the BBC. So he was certainly one of the mainstays of the DX hobby right through the period that I was associated with Mailbox.
Popular host Tony King of Mailbox back in 1990. In more recent times, it's been our pleasure to hear regular reports from a hardcore of New Zealand DXers like David Reckwish.
Hello, I'm David Reckwish in the Wellington studios of Radio New Zealand International for the last time here on Mailbox. I hope you've enjoyed the features about Pacific Radio I've been fortunate to share with you over the past 10 years for the Radio Heritage Foundation. You know, 65 years for a radio show is a very long time. Back in 1949, Mao Zedong had just created the People's Republic of China. The Berlin blockade was ending, the Polaroid camera and the 45 RPM record were introduced, and shortwave radio was still popular around the world. Also back in 1949, Rodgers and Hammerstein launched their hit musical South Pacific on Broadway, and along with Mailbox, we've shared the airwaves for these past 65 years. Mailbox may now be leaving the stage, but you'll continue to get a taste of the South Pacific whether you live in LA, Milan or Nice by tuning in to Radio New Zealand International in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you, David Reckwish there. Well, in the mid-1970s, Brian Clark hosted Mailbox.
I became interested in shortwave radio and DXing in the early 1960s and recall listening to Cleve Costello and Arthur Cushion with their program for shortwave listeners on the old 7.5 kilowatt transmitters at Tatahi Bay. In the mid-1970s, I briefly became personally involved with the program as host until May 1976, when the New Zealand government first closed down the shortwave service on economic grounds. Fortunately, heavy pressure from Pacific Islands governments, the news media and listeners resulted in the resumption of shortwave broadcasts from New Zealand just a month later, albeit a simple relay of the domestic national program. That service was closed down again in the 1980s, so it was certainly a big thrill when a new government approved the purchase and installation of the high-powered operation that Radio New Zealand International has operated since 1990, with a very small but highly effective team of broadcast professionals, providing an informative and audience-responsive service with such limited resources. It has been a privilege being part of this program, and I've enjoyed being able to share my DX listening experiences with Mailbox listeners over the past 7 years, working with Adrian Sainsbury and Myra O. Thank you to them and everyone in the RNZI team as they continue to provide an important communications channel for our Pacific Islands neighbours. This is Brian Clark signing off for Mailbox.
And now from John Durham, a tireless shortwave listener with many years of experience.
It's quite sad but not unexpected that Mailbox has come to an end after so many years. I have been a shortwave listener and DXer for the past 57 years and tuned in regularly to hear Arthur Cushion deliver the latest DX news via Radio New Zealand. Over the years, many shortwave broadcasters carry these types of programs of DX information and acknowledging listeners' correspondence. From Radio Australia, many will remember Keith Glover, and from the late 1950s into the 1960s, DX is Calling by Graham Hutchins. From Radio Canada, Errol Fisher, the Two Bobs from Swiss Radio, Arnie Skoog from Radio Sweden, and of course Media Network from Radio Netherlands. Alas, time moves on, and these types of programs are now being relegated to history and radio nostalgia. Since the advent of the internet and to a lesser degree FM radio, shortwave has struggled to maintain its relevance in today's world. Finally, I would like to thank Adrian Sainsbury and Myra O for the tireless work they have done over the years in making Mailbox possible. For the last time, this is John Durham in Tauranga wishing you all good DX and enjoyable shortwave listening.
Thank you, John Durham there. Kevin Han has been Mailbox's utility bands expert. Unfortunately, Kevin was unable to be with us today, but he did email to say how much he has enjoyed his time with Mailbox. Kevin says, keep up the good work. Thank you, Kevin.
And for our final report on solar conditions, let's cross to our intrepid reporter in Melbourne, Mike Bird.
The sunspots have returned to the surface of the sun. 8 in all are visible at the moment, after what has been roughly a 2-week period where we hardly had any sunspots visible at all. We believe sunspot cycle 24 has reached or is about to reach its maximum for this cycle, but to observe the sun without any sunspots for nearly 2 weeks is something I have never observed in my 40 years of observing the sun. All the predictions for solar cycle 24 warned us it would be a low one and a very different sunspot cycle, and they were right. Solar activity was low during the past fortnight due to the lack of sunspot regions, but on Thursday the 31st of July and Friday the 1st of August, we witnessed 3 low-strength M-class solar flares, which in turn produced low-strength shortwave fade-outs at times over Europe and the Americas. The solar flux, which is a measurement of the sun's radio noise at a frequency of 2,800 megahertz, ranged between 86 and 168 flux units, which corresponds to effective sunspot numbers of 29 up to 122. So a massive increase in the sunspot number over the past fortnight. The geomagnetic field was quiet to unsettled for the past fortnight thanks to the quiet sun. Unfortunately, the ionosphere suffered from a lack of solar radiation this past fortnight. Generally, the ionosphere couldn't support predicted maximum usable frequencies, and often even optimum working frequencies were a struggle. So if you found your usual reception wasn't quite up to its usual quality and strength, this was most probably the cause.
And what of the next few days, Mike?
Well, IPS Radio and Space Services expect solar activity will range between low to moderate levels, with a good chance some of the sunspots on the solar disk will produce some flares and shortwave fade-outs. As for the geomagnetic field, a small equatorial positioned coronal hole may increase the solar wind speed, which could send it into active thresholds at times, but IPS don't appear to be worried about it too much. As for the geomagnetic field, a small equatorial positioned coronal hole may increase the solar wind speed, which could send it into active thresholds at times. But IPS don't appear to be too worried about it. As for the ionosphere, all things considered, they are predicting normal, optimum and maximum usable frequencies.
After 40 years, Mike, how many sunspot maximums are we going to have in this cycle?
I don't know. I really don't know, but we have a new one. Solar cycle 24, in January 2014, the smooth sunspot number has risen to 77.4, and IPS are forecasting that the maximum will take place in April with a maximum of around 82. So we'll have to wait and see whether that prediction is correct.
Thank you, Mike. That's great to have the latest propagation news from you. And now, can you give us some idea of what's been happening at the ABC this past couple of weeks?
The Melbourne Age newspaper has reported that the Abbott government has identified in a secret report a further $60 million worth of cuts to the ABC. The Australian government and Rupert Murdoch have a close working relationship, and it is no secret that Murdoch would like the government to disband the ABC and SBS altogether. But of course that would be political suicide. So the government does the next best thing by cutting their budgets.
Right, thank you, Mike, for that. And seeing this is our last time together on Mailbox, good chance to go down memory lane. You've been in this game for a long time, haven't you?
Yes, I was first actually when I lived in the UK. I was a monitor for Radio Australia. Then I worked for Radio Australia, and then I freelanced with Radio Netherlands, and now I worked with you and Myra, and it's been a very interesting ride.
Yes, it's some emails from listeners have come in saying, "Oh dear, it's sad, but at least you're staying on the air." So that's putting a positive spin on it.
Yes, that's good. You are on the air. That's the main thing. Let's keep shortwave going. I love shortwave. Shortwave is a wonderful medium.
Yeah, I think it's a great favourite with quite a few people, particularly when you look at it as a worldwide thing, as opposed to perhaps within our own domestic audiences within Australia and New Zealand.
Yes, it's very different to domestic radio, and it's a wonderful way of propagating information around the world.
Mike, thank you very much for all your contributions over this past time, and we look forward to enjoying shortwave, even if we're not on the air to talk about it in Mailbox.
Well, thank you very much. It's been wonderful working with you and Myra, and it's been a great pleasure. And now time for some letters. Robert Moreno writes to us from Havana in Cuba. Hello, friends of RNZI. I am Roberto, a DXer from Havana, Cuba, writing for the first time to send a reception report to your station. I'm glad to receive a signal coming so far as the Pacific Ocean to me. I had to visit your website, and I must say I liked it very much, especially the news and tourism and the beautiful places that this island country you have. I would love to visit New Zealand before I die. It's paradise of the world. Thank you very much. It's not a bad place, Roberto, and we look forward to visiting us if you can, and certainly we'll be QSLing you. Despite the closure of Mailbox, that won't stop Myra and I from answering mail. Now, Richard Lemke writes to us from Alberta in Canada. Now, Richard's been listening to us for very many years. He writes, Dear Adrian, I've been a shortwave radio hobbyist since 1982. I don't really accept that Mailbox is now gone, and many have to be removed from the shortwave. What will the younger generation have to hear? I was very happy to hear all shortwave stations when I was young. Everything was a happy family of friends that came together to hear this fine hobby. Now it's being taken apart slowly. Lack of will by all persons to stand up together for shortwave. The best of luck in your work. Thank you, Richard. I don't think it's really quite as bad as you paint. It's just another process in the evolution. Thanks again, and good to hear you, and thank you for listening to us for all this time. A letter from Elias Giampuranis writes to us also, this time also from Canada, Montreal. He says, I hope this letter makes it to you for the last Mailbox show. I still think there is a need for such a program, as it adds personality to your broadcasts, makes us listeners feel as we are part of the global family. I will continue, however, to listen to Radio New Zealand International shortwave broadcasts up here in Canada, as I've been for many years. Please stay on shortwave and keep up the good work. Thank you, Elias. Another listener for many, many years is Eric Coe in Denmark, in Copenhagen. Hi, Adrian. I'm so sorry to hear your last Mailbox. If that's tomorrow, will be the last one. It's been one of my favourite letterbox programs since Tony King was host. It will be a loss for RNZI. Please find attached this recording from 1992.
Well, it's back to our letters and a fax, in fact, coming in from Denmark. It comes from Eric Coe in Copenhagen, and he tells us we're being received there very well indeed. And Eric, as probably some listeners know, listens on his car radio to Radio New Zealand International as he zooms around Copenhagen. So thank you, Eric, for your report fax to us this morning, and certainly we are putting a very good signal.
Tony King there raving on about a reception report there from Eric Coe. Thank you, Eric, for all your loyalty, listening to us all these years. And we hope that you will continue to hear us from time to time, so far away from our target area. And that's the letters for this program. Now, from my memory bank, looking back into the early 1990s, I remember persuading the manager of RNZI, Ian Johnston, at that time, that the future lay in the internet. It was so very primitive compared to today. In those days, RNZI was one of only about 10 stations in the world that had even an email address. The World Wide Web was in its beginning stages, with mostly only pages of text, and there was no audio streaming. So for me it was great to be involved launching the RNZI website and later audio streaming. It was real audio from memory. Another highlight was the introduction of digital shortwave, DRM, and that came in 2005. And for the first time, RNZI was able to deliver FM quality shortwave to our Pacific stations who relay our programs.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, this is it then. The time has come to say farewell. A great program, you agree?
Oh, absolutely.
It's made me very close to you, our listeners, and receiving letters from you and answering them. Don't you think, Adrian?
Without a doubt. That's been the greatest thing.
But like all good things, it has to come to an end, and this is it for us. So from us to say thank you for all the listening. It has been a great pleasure to be associated with Mailbox. So to all of you, we send our thanks for listening and all the very best for the future. From Maira O, ka kite.
And from Adrian Sainsbury, all the very best of DX listening.